Hey, Comics Cubers. Before we get to today's guest, I'd like to remind everyone that we do have a Patreon now. The link is down below. If you like the Comics Cube, if you want the Comics Cube to keep going, if you're feeling generous, please consider donating to the one tier over there, which is basically $1 per month. Think of it as a tip jar. I'd greatly appreciate it. No pressure. Today's guest is writer, artist, and legendary colorist of books such as Watchmen and The Killing Joke. Please welcome Mr. John Higgins. I'm sorry I introduced you as legendary colorist. I'm doing this off the cuff. You actually do, you do pencils, you do inks, you write. But would you say it's coloring that you're best known for?
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that I really enjoy about doing the coloring I have done is because it's been with two of the biggest selling books in DC history and probably comics history. More people know me as a colorist than as the all round artist that I am. So I'm very happy to be known as the legendary colorist, but I'd like to be known as a very good penciler, inker, and writer. So yeah.
Do you prefer coloring though? Like, is that because since that's what you've made most of your career out of?
Not really. I mean, sort of like color is when I first started in the business. I mean, I came in as a color artist, and because of the sort of work that I was trying to do, which was anything related to science fiction, basically, 2000 AD, which some of your viewers might know of, in the UK is one of the biggest science fiction comics magazine, and it's legendary, it's been going for so long.
Yeah.
And when I first started in the business, science fiction is the thing that I wanted to do, but there's so few outlets for comics as such. I mean, things have changed so much, obviously, in the last 30, 40 years. But when I first came into the business, I wanted to do book covers, science fiction book covers, and record album covers. One, because the fantasy and the surrealistic elements were things that really appealed to my mindset. And I love the fact that like science fiction could like create unbelievable worlds. But once 2000 AD started a science fiction comic, and it was a regular weekly possibility outlet for me, then I really started drifting into doing black and white line work, which is predominantly what 2000 AD required at that particular time.
Yeah.
But my first love was to paint just fantastic, hopefully fantastic scenes, believably, for science fiction book covers and record album covers, sort of thing. So the color side of it was just because I wanted to depict images that were completely and utterly believable. But as everyone knows, like when you tell a story, even if it is in black and white, you can draw people into that world just because of the strength of the words and the pictures. So drifting into black and white predominantly was something that I'm very happy with, and I'm still happy to do predominantly more black and white line work with added digital color, which is not the same, obviously, as doing the coloring for Watchmen or Killing Joke or fully painted work, because it is you're distanced from it in a way that when you paint something, it's
physical.
You smell the paint and you get messy, and it's a very pleasing thing to do.
I skipped the first question that I usually ask everyone, which is why do you love this art form?
I think comics for me is that perfect synthesis of all the things that I love. And I think probably, as I said, more so in the last, since my career started, because science fiction has become a very strong aspect of what certainly my field of expertise, you say. I mean, superheroes have that wonderful crossover, particularly when you get really good writers. Yeah. They don't just talk about like fighting villains. They'll talk about aliens, the Krull coming from other planets, or the Planet Eater coming in, and the Silver Surfer, and so on and so forth. There's so many different ways now of introducing science fiction into action, adventure, superhero comics. So it's that great crossover now. So I just love that aspect of like anything is believable and wonderful in the world of comics in a way that's, I know now, so like to a certain extent, the movies have caught up completely and utterly with what we originally did in comics, but for a very long time, as we know, it's like it's only in the last 10, 15 years, it's like we can actually see what we used to produce on the comics page. So yeah, I mean, it's just that wonderful, the imagination now so like can get drawn into the comic page in a way that nothing else can, even with added music and full color in movies. I think it's something about holding something in your hand and so like, you know, being able to like go backwards and forwards as many times as you want is a very satisfying thing to do.
I've always thought that one of the strengths of the superhero genre is that it is I think the only genre that can play in every other genre there is. Right? So you can be sci-fi, you can do westerns, you've done an issue of Jonah Hex, for example, and so on
Oh,
and
well
so
done.
forth. Yeah.
You've
Uh,
done your research. Well,
I try to do that. But when it comes to doing album covers, would you say that, for example, we're talking about the 70s there, and I would go on to say that in the 1970s, album covers were probably more imaginative than they would eventually become, because eventually album covers would be about showcasing the artist more. I feel the same way about movie posters. So do you feel like you kind of dodged a bullet by getting into comics instead?
I think I probably did actually. Yeah, I mean, it's now the sort of like whole CD covers, and it would have been the same with album covers. The artist is the thing that sells it, you know. And
Mhm.
when I first started getting into music and art, well, certainly for me, it was the image you used to draw you in. Obviously, if you think of The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, should we say, or anything that David Bowie did,
Mhm.
you know, this like the covers. Once we had like imagery of like David Bowie. I mean, he was such a beautiful human being, physically as well as mentally and musically. I mean, when you have an image that's just as fantastic as anything you can imagine, which is David Bowie, whichever Ziggy Stardust, or however he presented himself, you know, then you started seeing the beautiful imagery of the creators rather than like my beautiful imagery or the other great artists who were working on album covers. I mean, I suppose to a certain extent, book covers were my more realistic SF book covers were really the direction I really wanted to go into for a number of different reasons. One, because the imagery could be pure science fiction, and that really is my driving creative force even now. If I get something that's specifically science fiction orientated, that's my first love, you know. And I just, and comics has that, and comics, as you say, so you know, superhero comics now, just seeing these stunning imagery you can get just by depicting beautiful people dressed weirdly, wonderfully, outlandishly is just a very satisfying thing to do.
Have you ever? I think I see a lot of in the Facebook groups, for example, in the art community, I see kind of a pushback against sci-fi and fantasy art, coming from quote unquote real artists. Um, has that always been a thing, even back then? Like maybe portrait and landscape artists or like fine arts collectors, kind of see a sci-fi and fantasy art as like a kind of lower form.
Yeah, yes, very much
Why
so.
is that?
Yeah, I know. It's really weird. I mean, I think a lot of science fiction writers had that stigma as well. I mean, it's always one of the things that makes me laugh is sort of like, you know, some of the best social commentary was science fiction
Mhm.
or SF, Aldous Huxley, Brave New World and, 1984. I mean, even now, like, people, even though it's like 20 years later, people will still use 1984 and Big Brother to describe what's happening in society around the world today. And that's the thing that I find quite stunning, is the fact that, like, that stigma. And I suppose, and to a certain extent, I've found that sort of like which again, going back to what you suggest, is like going into comics has made me appreciate depicting fantastical images better in a more interesting way for myself, because digital, and I know using the dirty AI word is anathema now to any real artist, but the imagery now, digital imagery, even like 10, 15 years ago, when people were using digital imagery to depict fantastic worlds, it tended to, a great image is a great image, but it tended to devalue what could be done by, as you suggested, a proper artist, in the context, when you're drawing something, when you're painting something, and certainly now when you're telling stories with line and ink, it's so directly comes straight from the artist's mind, eye,
Yes.
hand coordination. So for an artist, it's an incredibly satisfying thing. And also when I talk to people like yourself and, go around the world and talk to fans, I mean, the appreciation that they have of what I do, no matter how, I don't know, it's a simple black and white line drawing, but then you make it work in so many different levels by the storytelling, by the way you crop it in, etc., etc. And obviously when you add colour, which I have to talk about because I'm well known for being a colourist, as you might have started with. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I love most about comics is how it touches people of any age. And as I say, when I go to conventions around the world and you see people of all ages, and to a certain extent, you can sort of like thank the big Marvel and DC movies for actually bringing in a new wave of young people. Before the movies came out, I think to a certain extent, you tended to feel it was an age group that was sort of like being locked into what I started with, and they were all the same fans and the same age as me. But because of the movies now, young people will be coming in and buying, Superman or Batman or whatever, because they like the movie and then they want to carry it on and enjoy it because they can hold it in the hand. So yeah, I mean, it's great when you talk to people around the world and talking to yourself and sort of like about, it's that great brotherhood, we all love brother and sisterhood. The fact that we all love
No, it's true,
one particular art form, and it's just great, because of what I do in my little tiny wooden studio at the bottom of my garden. I can sort of like reach people in the Philippines, in South America, and Brazil, and North America, Canada, all over Europe, just because of what I do in my little studio on the south coast of England. So, brilliant.
I love that the other country and not continent that you named is Brazil, because according to my Google Analytics, Brazil is just so huge when it comes to comics, and I would like to see that one day. Anyway, I digress. But I digress.
I would definitely recommend it. We went there just a couple of months ago, and everyone thankfully knows Watchmen, me through Watchmen and Killing Joke, but I seem to have a little fan base, or a large fan base, because Brazil is very, very big. But some of my comics are being produced there. My own particular comic, Razorjack, which I created and originally published in the 90s, that's being reprinted in Brazil. So I actually have people coming to me with my comic in Brazil that's in Portuguese, and it's just so satisfying, And obviously the great thing is, like, when you see people dressed as, even in the incredible heat that they had when we went over a couple of months ago, as Rorschach, or poor old Rorschach with his hat and his coat on, but he looked good.
We were talking about sci-fi and fantasy art being looked down upon by quote unquote real artists, but of course, a medium that has been looked down upon by quote unquote real writers and artists historically has been comics. But when you started making comics, one of your first gigs was with a writer named Alan Moore. And did
What
you?
did he ever go on to do? Do you know what happened to him?
I don't know. He might be a novelist now or something. But uh, did you know that when you started working with him? Well, of course you didn't 100% know, but could you feel that something was changing here?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. When I first started doing stuff for 2000 AD, even if I just related to 2000 AD, which is all science fiction, that obviously John Wagner, who created
Dread.
a lot of Dread and a
Yeah.
lot of other characters of 2000 AD, a great writer that he is, he was approaching things in a certain sort of way because he knew the British market at that particular time. And when Alan came in, he not only shook up what the audience might be reading, but he also made very talented writers like John Wagner and Garth Ennis and lots of other writers so look at what they were doing rather than just trying to please the audience as such. They decided, well, let's please myself and my contemporaries, and let's talk about democracy or something, which is what one of the biggest storylines and one of the most successful storylines I did with John Wagner was the Democracy series. And so what Alan did when he first came in, he was writing for the audience, but what he was obviously we're freelance, we're trying to make a living. And he was doing things in ways that really were unusual and unexpected, even in the confines of what he was trying to do to sell to the market of science fiction 2000 AD at that particular time.
And
I
up to
remember,
5 pages max, right? Up to
pardon?
5 pages max, like in
Yeah,
2000
I know.
AD.
Mad, isn't it? He could get so many ideas into just those 5 pages. He was exceptional. In even that long ago, he was someone different to anyone else at that particular time, and he certainly showed it. And the great thing is for me, I actually started doing more stuff for 2000 AD, and those 5-page Future Shocks, which is the series that's the series called. He was we started more or less the same time, and I did quite a few short stories with Alan, and some of them are just so funny.
Yeah.
I'm smiling just remembering some of the absurd concepts and things he came up with. Then obviously he always had the thinking about it. I mean, I'm just realised probably, but he always had a sense of humour, and he had a sense of humour in a way that he carried on into Watchmen. As dark as that was, and as dark as Killing Joke was. There's always that edge, and the fact that Batman and Joker just laughing at the very last page, it's just he had a way to bring you in so many different ways and turn things on its head. Yeah, and it was very recognizable even then. And I remember going into the offices, and the editor that I was dealing with at the time was Steve McManus, who oversaw probably the most successful run of 2000 AD. And he said, this is another good one from Alan, to me. And it was so satisfying to do. And he always gave you so much to work with. Alan put so much detail in. It's just quite mind-blowing, the sort of stuff that you had to fight through almost to get to the image. But it was always so entertaining.
Like one of those scripts, like one of those legendary scripts. Did he write so densely even back then?
Yeah, I mean, he was entertaining the editor and the writer and the artist as much as the audience. And you can imagine him having as much fun sitting there and maybe chuckling to himself in his beard. So thinking about the sort of jokes that he was putting in there. And a lot of the scripts, I know they've reprinted a lot of the scripts now because they are so entertaining. But he would talk about, rolling his sleeves up, pinning his bloodshot eyes open and whatever. And that was just to the editor, and it was just so funny just reading the full script.
You mentioned that you loved drawing those stories because some of them were so funny. Did you have any favorites?
Um, there was well, there was actually two that's like that spring to mind because they were just so stupidly visual. I mean, one was just a double. They were both 2 pages. One was a 2-pager, double page spread in the centre of 2000 AD, and that was quite nice because someone else would actually colour it up for me, which seems weird now when I talk about it, but they had like a professional colorist who worked in the studios in those days.
Wow.
I mean, it was just so, it was probably like the bullpen used to be in Marvel.
Yeah.
In New York. And it was just about where a couple goes on to Easter Island, where you have the big Easter Island eggs.
Oh, I remember this one.
Yeah. And his son, he falls asleep and his son buries him in the sand. And then he's just stuck there and he wonders, I can't get out, I'm stuck. And they'd just forgotten about him. They'd left him on the island, gone off, how they managed it doesn't matter, but the whole point is suddenly a big voice comes down, so like saying, it happened to me too. And there's an Easter Island head saying, yeah, that happened to me 100 years ago. And it's just the absurdity and the stupidity of the whole thing. It's just very, very clever. But to actually do it in just 2 pages were just very, very funny. And then the other one was sort of like alien invasion type thing. And it's like and it's over 1.5 pages. And again, it just amazed me that Alan could actually cram so much into so little. And it's just where these aliens, a flying saucer comes down over the UK, the army comes out, and when the aliens come out, they're all cucumbers and potatoes and apples, they're all vegetables.
Oh, it's the humanitarian one.
Yes. And it's just sort of hilarious, like the fact that the way his mind worked and twisted into something so absurd,
Yeah.
But I think the aliens definitely weren't vegan because they ate humans.
And yeah, what would you say is the biggest influence on your art style?
Oh, there's so many, and so like for a very long time, I think my influences showed. For me, when I was at art college, I discovered Richard Corbin, and probably in some ways my colouring still reflects the colour palette that Richard Corbin just sheared, just he got it in my brain and I can't get it out, just those vivid colouring, and to excite you visually is something that Richard Corbin showed me the direction of going. That's a path I'm going for all of my career. But also the way he told stories, and also the way the drama and depiction of humans, the human form, is just so stunning. And obviously Bernie Wrighton would be another one, and John Buscema, Conan. These guys were just so, the fact that they, certainly with John Buscema, so he used to be producing, every single month, these stunning pieces of, human anatomy. Yeah, and it just blows my mind just thinking about it now. These guys producing that type of work day in, day out. Yeah, so there's so many artists, and all my contemporaries. I just look around and see what people who are doing. I've got. I still buy comics, so there's an advert for Mark Miller and Pepe Larraz, who are 2 of my favorite creators. That's a good advert for them.
You still take new things and work it into your art?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I try to do stuff because I'm incredibly lucky with the people I collaborate with. They ask me to do stuff from secret agents to superhero stuff. I did a Batman for DC at the beginning of the year, which I wrote, illustrated, and it was in black and white, so I didn't color that one, funny enough. But so I go across the whole gamut of sort of comic genre sort of thing, from science fiction through to murder mystery, basically. And I just really enjoy it. So whatever approach I take is dictated by the story.
So I'm trying to recall an interview with Alan Moore that I read a long time ago, and I'm probably not going to remember it well, but he did say that at one point he tried writing a Judge Dredd script, and in 2008 he said, no, we've already got John Wagner, um, which I feel doesn't quite happen 10 years later. But uh, but so I'm gonna ask you to compare working with Alan over working with John Wagner in that case.
It's a weird thing to say, but I actually prefer working with John Wagner.
Really?
John Wagner, yeah, John Wagner's like the best writers for me. Not necessarily. I'm not saying in the context of storytelling or stories, but the best professional writers for me are the ones who give me exactly what I need and don't entertain me with page after page after page of entertaining discourse. And when I was like working on even if like I don't know, a 5-page future shock, I would get 15 pages of telling you what happens in each panel, blah, 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 which is wonderful, but a lot of hard work. I mean, if you looked at the way Dave Gibbons went through and highlighted the script for Watchmen
Mhm.
to get down to what he actually needed to depict in each panel. So that's the only drawback for me as a working professional. I mean, John Wagner just gives you an introduction to the page, then he basically just gives you directions, camera directions. He will not tell you there's a Gunga Diner box blowing across in the background, whereas Alan would. And it might give you grist and information for creating the world. But what John Wagner does, he creates that, and then he tells a story, and then it's left up to you to like put the Gunga Diner box blowing across the background. So yeah, I mean, John Wagner, it's not a better writer or a worse writer. It's just the fact that John Wagner wrote comic scripts, and Alan Moore tended to write Alan Moore stories. And that's the only, in a professional capacity, the only difference. They're both incredible storytellers, but
Yeah.
John Wagner is he's someone special, definitely.
I've spoken to many of Alan's collaborators, and they do say that because the scripts are so dense, even though he says that you're free to make any changes, it's so dense that a lot of them feel like, well, there's nothing to change.
Yeah.
So in that way, like some of them would prefer working with somebody else who would give them a little bit more flexibility to change the
I
story a
mean,
little
it's
bit.
one of those things. So as soon as you read the script, once you sort of like break it down, then you're starting to solidify the direction even for yourself. Even if I break down my script, anyone's script into even a thumbnail, I've started to sort of like solidify the direction, and that sometimes becomes restricted or restrictive to the way I approach the rest of the story. So I'm still approaching the way I produce comic strips now. I still haven't got a method that I prefer most.
Mhm.
But if I work from a looser script, funny enough, I've never done the Marvel way. I've never worked from a Marvel script where they just give you a synopsis for each page and then allows you freedom to do whatever you want. I've always worked from the DC format or the 2000 AD format, which is panel by panel and panel description, and they've already worked out what the dialogue's going to be. I mean, there's a bit of fluctuation when they can change things at the editorial stage if you've gone off into a slightly different direction. But it's really interesting because Alan was so incredibly visual. In a way, it's like he's probably one of the most visual comic strip storytellers I know. A lot of comic strip writers might not be as visual, but they might tell a better comic strip story because they don't give the artist too much to focus on. So
Okay.
it's a really nice debate, actually. That's a very good question.
That's
I've never
interesting.
been asked that question before, and I've been asked a lot of questions. So thank you. That's
Yes.
given me a lot to think about.
We've mentioned two writers. Do you have a favorite writer to work with?
Well, if I have sort of like one favorite writer on a number of different levels, not just the sort of work we do together, I'm incredibly fortunate of working with some of the best writers across the board in comics. You know, I've worked with them all. Well, not them all, but certainly the British generation. I've probably worked with every one of them who's gone on to become superstars. They all left me behind. But anyway, they've gone on to be superstars. But the one that's probably, as a person, as a sort of like a script writer, and as a bloke that I like hanging out with, they're all great fun. But like for me, Garth Ennis is the guy I like in particular in a number of different ways.
That is, I had a feeling you were going to say Garth Ennis, and I don't really know why. So I'm going to ask you why. He just seems like a really fun guy.
He is very, very good fun. He's and plus the fact his scripting is, funny enough, very similar to John Wagner's, the way he presents it to you, and he knows exactly what he wants. So he's incredibly visual, and but he also, he never sort of like, he never seems to repeat the same thing. Everything I've ever done with Garth has always been off the tangent. I'm actually just working on a story with Garth, and my wife is my colorist now. I mean, Sally Jane Hurst, and we work together. So she's working in the main building, which is the house behind me. And we're just finishing off a story with Garth Ennis that we're doing for Rebellion, and it's called Dredger. And it's just so unusual. It's so, I have never, it's so like action adventure. It's not science fiction, even though I was banging on about how much I love science fiction, and I do. But anything that Garth does, I'm very happy to sort of like, leave science fiction behind and just get involved with the world that Garth Ennis creates. But a number of things I like about Garth is the fact that, like, if you think, if I have a very strange, violent, disturbed mind, only on the page though. I'm a very normal, happy-go-lucky married man of, whatever sort of thing. So I like my cup of tea in the morning, a toast, whatever. So a very simple life. But in my mind, I am slightly loopy because I'm allowed to express these mad, weird, violent thoughts onto page. And I am surprised how far Garth can go with his violent imagery. And again, he's one of the quietest, nicest, subdued people I know. But when he writes the imagery, it's just so mind-blowingly somewhere else. So yeah, he always surprised me. Anyway, the thing that we're working on the moment is just one of those I would definitely recommend. It's going to be an action, a British collected edition that's going to coming out later on in the year. So battle action. So definitely check that out with Redger and John Higgins and Sally Jane Hurst. So
Well, I was gonna say when you said that Garth could get really violent, I was gonna say that's an understatement.
yeah.
Who do you like better, working with Garth Ennis or working with a writer of Razorjack?
Funny enough, probably Garth Ennis actually.
Really?
Yeah, because he buys drinks to me. I can get two drinks with two writers, whereas if I only, the Razorjack writer will only buy me one drink.
That is true. I mean, you could buy yourself multiple drinks.
Funny enough, I do usually, but it can be a very sad life.
Razorjack
Talking to
is
one person, it's that echo chamber. You need to like bounce ideas off people. So, but then again, having said that, I do work with a very creative person, which is Sally Jane Hurst, and my collaborator and colorist and best friend in the world.
Dave Gibbons has said the same thing to me about working on the originals, is that working on a project that is mostly just you uh, is a very different beast. So Razorjack, of course, I'm being cheeky. The writer of Razorjack is you. Razorjack debuted in 1999,
Yep.
and is about three students who somehow make an opening into an alternate universe. Some of my viewers might not be familiar with it because, frankly, I'm not sure where my viewers are from. But so, would you like to give us a quick elevator pitch for Razorjack?
Well, Razorjack is your worst nightmare. She is one of those people who's a demigod in a different dimension. And all she wants to do is destroy life across every dimension and every universe and every single thing in it. That's her ultimate aim. You know, she's one of the best villains ever, sort of thing. She doesn't want power, she doesn't want fame, she doesn't want money. She just wants to kill everything. And she has minions. She has not the little cute yellow things, but she has big cyborg type of it's all female cross. You know, the women is like the villains and the warriors in this particular world that I've created, and they cross over into the Earth Prime, which is this is our world, and someone's cry of pain in our world on Earth can bring over warriors from Razorjack's world. And funny enough, the next job I'm doing, I'm working on the script now, which is a Razorjack script. And don't read it because you know it's still under wraps. But the next job after Dredger with Garth is going to be Razorjack, so I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm just working through it at the moment. But the thing that I'm really pleased about is, like, you know, my own little way. I'm sort of like my own little publishing industry, and with the help of a lot of talented independent publishers, you know, it's actually slowly getting out there. It has been reprinted in Brazil, and I'm in talks with a Brazilian publisher. I'll try and say the publisher's name properly, Pipoca Nanquim, which they've actually reprinted World Without End that I did with Jamie Delano X amount of years ago. So they've reprinted that, and that's come out, which was the reason we went over to Brazil a couple of months ago to talk to people, and it's the launch of World Without End. So I'm talking to them about doing a new edition of Razorjack, so fingers crossed on that. So, you know, it's one of those things, so like every now and then I actually have to make a living. So actually all the time I have to make a living. But every now and then I have the joy of like not making a living and actually producing, you know, Razorjack, which that's not really paid its way yet, but I'm still sort of like working on it. Hopefully one day it will pay its way. So
It'll get there. It'll get there.
yeah, I think it will one day.
I want to talk about two works that you knew I was going to ask you about. Um, and in 1986, I was 3 years old and I started reading comics for the first time. And in every single DC comic, on the bottom left corner of the cover was a blurb that said, "Who watches the Watchmen?" I did not actually read it until 15 years later. But when I did read it, one of the things that stuck out to me was because when I finally did read it, it was in the middle of you know that age where computers just started being used for coloring, and it was kind of obvious. Um, but one of the things that stuck out to me was the coloring because it looked so different palette wise from a standard 1980s superhero comic. And I was wondering if you could take me through your thought process on that. And if you were given any editorial leeway or more flexibility in order to be able to do that.
Oh, the wonderful thing about that was, one, obviously working with Dave and Alan again, but Dave and I had done a couple of things where I'd coloured some of his work, because as I said earlier, I came into comics as a colour painter, as an artist, as a colour artist, as a painter, the all-round pencils, inks, painting.
Yeah.
Whereas most British artists at that particular time were black and white line artists, and Dave Gibbons and Steve Dillon, funny enough, was another artist I worked with in the early days. So like they would give me the pencils or the inks, and then I would paint over there or color up blue lines. And that's how I got to know Dave Gibbons in particular. So we'd worked on a couple of things together. And obviously Alan and I had worked together quite a bit for the first 10 years of my career. And sort of like when we started when Alan and Dave started talking about doing something, they wanted to keep, definitely wanted it to be completely different to the standard American comic format. And there's no reason to a certain extent why they couldn't have gone with a very talented American colorist, you know, because they were very, very talented American colorists at that particular time as they are now. But because we'd worked together and because he and Alan had such a close working relationship, I think they wanted to keep the team very, very small. So to actually have someone like myself who lived 10 miles down the road sort of thing, and I could come in and meet them regularly, then it became a thing, well, why not just make the little nest of creators and we can do whatever we want because of Alan. And Dave has already proved what he could do with Green Lantern. I think, I'm not sure if it was the core, Green Lantern core, but he'd proved he could do stuff that, well, was top notch. So the pair of them, particularly with Alan, sort of like driving the bus, basically, they could, to a certain extent, do whatever they wanted. And so they wanted me, and I couldn't have been happier, you know, allowing for the fact that for a while it seemed like I couldn't get any work. Whenever I went into the offices, they said, "Oh, we don't have any colouring work for you," even though I'd gone there as a penciler or an inker or a cover artist or something. You know, it seemed like a bit of a cul-de-sac, and it was a very nice cul-de-sac, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to be known as penciler, inker, all-round artist sort of thing. So working with such a small knit group sort of thing, we talked about what we want to do right from the very, very beginning. And like they involved me very, you know, literally before they'd even put pen to paper, or certainly before Dave put pen to paper. I'm not even sure if Alan had written a script at that stage, certainly not for the first issue. But he was, they'd obviously had an idea. They knew the sort of direction they were going to go with it. It was basically deconstructing superheroes. So I was involved, mainly just sitting, listening to two brilliant creators talking about what they would like to do in this world that they were creating. And it was just incredibly satisfying just to be sitting there and listening to what they want to do, and particularly in a way because it was literally at the first step of the ladder of what created Watchmen. And what we ended up doing is sort of like, you know, I was hearing how they were going to, we didn't know they were going to change the world of how people looked at superheroes, but we certainly I got an idea that it was going to be completely different to anything else that they'd had at that particular time. So yeah, it was completely different to anything that had ever appeared on the shelves. And thankfully I was asked to be one of the people to make it look different as well.
And can you take me through how you came up with a color palette for that? Like, was that in the script? Did you decide on that with Dave beforehand? Because it really did look different. Like whenever I think about the coloring for it, the single panel that I always think of is Ozymandias saying, "I did it." And the way that is lit, it just seems so appropriate and moody. And I'm talking about the original coloring, by the way.
All right.
So can you talk to me about how you guys came up with a palette for it?
The thing that I found really interesting about Watchmen in particular, the Killing Joke was different because it was basically Killing Joke was more or less a full color approach to the coloring. Whereas for me, to do hand seps, which probably everyone now knows, is like where you give a guide and then hand separators separate them into multiple layers, and then it's sent off to the printers. The printers match them together, and very well, it was very cheap to do in those days. It sounds very cost-effective way of doing things now when you talk about it. But for me, the limitations were incredibly restrictive. So I had to think outside of my colouring box, basically. So the way I approached it was sort of like, was restricted by DC's colour palette. I'd never had that before. So I actually had to go back to the sort of my beginnings, basically. And when I was at art college, we did talk about the theory of colour and the way that great masters use certain colours to get certain effects. And there's a book that we had as de rigueur reading, which was the concept of perception. And in there, it had a section on colouring. And to a certain extent, I mean, it's all straightforward. You know the sky's blue, the grass is green, red is danger, orange, warm, blah, 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 sort of thing. But it showed you how to mix the colour palette. So basically what I came up with was sort of like dictated to by the limitations of the colouring palette that we had from DC.
Interesting.
And when Dave and I and Alan talked about the colouring, which we did very, very early on, none of us had the idea of the fact that the colour would become a concept in a way that became almost Watchmen concept of colouring, because we were dictated to by outside forces to a certain extent. So when I spoke to Alan, had ideas, he knew what he wanted colour to do, which was where Rorschach was going to Morlock's apartment. And
he's going to ask about this. Yeah.
And it's just beautiful, Alan's concept of slight light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. And so that concept was his concept. I had to come up with a color combination, but the concept of using the light, dark was his. And it's also when the comedian goes in and talks to him when he's breaking down, and a couple of issues later, a couple of chapters later, we have that flashing outside light. And that's just such clever concept as the way Alan thought. I'm not totally sure anyone else would have thought of that detail. I think Alan would have been the only one who would come up with that type of detail. And it was just such a clever tie-in from Rorschach to the comedian and Morlock, going from one scene to the next. Very, very clever. And it's the colour that Dave came up with, he knew the sort of colours he wanted for the characters. Mm-hmm. So then I had to incorporate that, as I say, within the concept of what the colour palette we could get from DC. So to a certain extent, we did talk about colour, but the way I had to make it all unfold within the world of Watchmen was something that I had to come up with. Unfortunately, by myself, I would have preferred someone to be there and saying, "Does this work?" I could have that sort of conversation. But the great thing was, because I did meet Dave regularly, and whenever I came over with the new colouring, the first thing he usually used to say was, "Really?" I did surprise him with the colouring, but he would never say we'll change anything. So, and the great thing also, coming back 25 years later when we did the digital remastering of Watchmen, I was thinking, well, I could do anything. I could make all the colours complete enough to go all over the place to wherever I wanted. And Dave said, no, we have the Watchmen palette. You stick to that. And the only thing I did when we digitalized it was get rid of the continuity errors, because there were some things I had no idea, and I don't think maybe Alan knew he was going to start off with when Rorschach was talking to Daniel in his kitchen and he's unwrapping the sugar cubes. We had a sugar color. And I had no idea in issue 11 we'd be having the same color cubes being thrown and strewn into the snows of the Antarctic. So it's all these things were starting to unfold when we started getting into the run of Watchmen, that I had to make sure I got right the second time round, which we did. So that was a great thing about doing the digital colouring of the Watchmen. But the great thing was sort of like, Dave said, no, it's got the Watchmen colouring, keep it the Watchmen colouring. I don't know what I would have done, but I probably would have gone slowly mad if I'd have tried to do some new Watchmen colouring. Thankfully, I didn't. Thankfully, Dave has got his mind thrown on.
I want to bring back up the scenes in Moloch's apartment because I talked to people, I talked to multiple people about it, and some of them, I think they were in film school at the time, and the thing that they were saying was that it was the visual equivalent of that kind of thing in film where you could kind of hear a heartbeat in the background.
Oh, wonderful.
And it's true, you guys really created a mood with that alternating lighting.
Oh, that's lovely. That's a really nice concept. I love that concept. I like that idea a lot.
It's
I will be telling other people I might even credit you with when I tell people when I give talks about Watchmen in the future. We did intend to do the heartbeat.
Yeah,
No,
just say it.
But it was great that you saw it or your contemporaries saw it. So yeah, definitely.
And I wanted to ask about, because I did want to ask about the digital coloring because the emotional aspect of color. I mean, I do think that historically colorists don't get credited enough. Usually it's the writer and the penciler, and then sometimes the inker. But the emotional aspect that color brings, if you had recolored Watchmen more drastically than you did with the Absolute Edition and all the editions moving forward, uh, it would have almost felt like a different story, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent we could go back to Killing Joke and sort of like the way the sort of like Brian did modern coloring, and one of the criticisms that I've heard that people would sort of like say, well, it's not of the time, and so like I don't know what Brian would have done at the time, but I know he wanted a more muted Dark Knight color palette. So I think the thing is, to a certain extent, the direction of coloring. To a certain, I was talking to Bob Wayne, who used to be the DC's PR and media guy. Just like I can't remember his full title, but Bob used to be the guy who went out and did promotion and made sure people had enough copies in the shops and stuff like that. Of whatever new edition was coming out, as well as the Watchmen. And he actually, Bob Wayne, I could actually like point to as like being a success in the sales figures wise of after the collected edition got collected, after the movie came out. He talked DC into printing 1 million copies or close to 1 million copies of the collected edition of Watchmen after the movie, before the movie came out, and everyone was saying you're not going to be able to sell that many copies, but they did, because he had basically had the 2-hour advert of Watchmen, and everyone wanted to be buying a bit of that Watchmen. As we said earlier, the movies will bring in new people who might only have one graphic novel on their bookshelf, but they will have that one, Watchmen or Batman or whatever. So Bob Wayne, I've got a great affection for a number of different reasons, but that was one of them, the fact that he talked DC into printing so many copies of the collected edition after the movie, or before the movie, and after the movie they did sell. And I've forgotten your question.
I was asking about the emotional impact of coloring.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's the thing that even in the early days before I fully understood it, and before I actually, in the concept of the color perception in the book, as I said, like, emotionals, you can calm people down by showing them green, blue, brown, your muted colors, and you can excite people by orange, red, purple, combinations of such. So I knew there's an effect that you could get by mixing those colors. So in the early days, we knew, like, when the comedian was being murdered, I knew red was going to give you that sort of emotion response immediately. You didn't have to know this, like, what was unfolding. until you started reading it. But as soon as you flick to that scene, the red is going to like suddenly excite you. So emotionally, it's going to draw you in and make you all ready. So like your heart's going to start beating faster, and your eyes are going to be wider open, and you're going to perceive it in a completely different way than just going in if it was just coloured in a muted palette. And that, having said that, I mean, you can then do very film noir or comic noir with a muted palette. So there's lots of different ways of approaching that type of coloring. But yes, an emotional response is definitely something that I was certainly going for from the very early days. And I didn't realize how good a job I'd done until I speak to people such as yourself who know a lot about comics and obviously have a lot of grounding in other media as well. And I do love that. I can't stop thinking about the heartbeat, and I think that's a lovely concept and metaphor for the colouring. That's a very. I just think of flashing light, but yeah, it's a heartbeat. That's lovely. I like it. Thank you.
The is I'm sure there was no way to know in the very beginning that a maxi series full of Charlton Comics characters analogs was going to end up being one of, if not the most critically acclaimed comic book of all time. But it did come out in the span of over a year. So at which point did you realize Watchmen was big?
I think there was two things, and for me it was really interesting because, as I said, I was working very closely with Dave in particular. But when we used to bump into Alan, you know, after the first couple of issues came out, we were certainly getting feedback from the media and the fans. But for me, I can't remember if it was the first or the second issue. It was very, very early on. And Archie Goodwin was working for, Archie Goodwin was one of the greatest editors to come out of American comics.
Absolutely.
And one of the greatest writers for me, you know, when he was working for Creepy and Eerie in the early days. And like he had a great reputation as just being an all-around nice guy, and he was. And he sent Dave, can't remember, it was a Walmart carrier bag, but on the carrier bag there was a smiley face, of all things. And Archie had drawn a blood splash and so like said to Dave, you know, Dave, this is where you're going to go, basically. And to get that sort of kudos from someone who's incredibly knowledgeable and talented, who worked professionally in the business for 10, 20 years before we arrived, was an acknowledgement of we were doing something right. And then, you know, the media picked it up. And as soon as you get that crossover into mainstream media, we were getting credits and reviews in broadsheets, you know, like the New York Times or the London Times. And the fact that they weren't making fun out of it, you would say, you know, they were treating it as serious, maybe not so much serious literature, but they were reviewing it in a way that comics hadn't been done up until that point. And so that was really, really satisfying. And I think to a certain extent, I mean, we were incredibly lucky because there was lots of creators coming within the business at that particular time, you know, like Frank Miller and, you know, all the other books, you know, Mouse and so on and so forth. It's like, you know, we're starting to be looked at as, we're starting to lean into literature now. This is not just a story about supervillains fighting superheroes. This is like something deeper than that and more entertaining than that.
Yeah, like that was a whole great time for comics. You know, we had you guys, Frank Miller, Walt Simonson, Bill Sienkiewicz, Dennis Cowan, etc. It's just such a productive and like such an innovative time
Very
for comics. In 2011, I believe it was, you became the only member of the Watchmen team, along with Len Wein, to contribute to the Watchmen prequel before Watchmen, which was a pretty controversial set of books. What prompted your decision to do the Crimson Corsair?
If I had a sort of like a big pile of greenback dollar notes here, I'd throw them up in the air and all these dollars would come floating down. That might be a visual clue of why I would do something like Before Watchmen. It was slightly controversial with fans, and I think to a certain extent, I talked to Dave about it, obviously, because if he'd have said no, I wouldn't have done it. But he had no problem. He said, you're freelance, you know, you're self-employed, you know, this is what you do for a living. So with his blessing, should we say, you know, I knew it'd be an interesting job no matter which way I was going to approach it. And plus the fact the idea of being the last standing Watchmen original creator was actually quite nice, because Dave had gone on to other things, and obviously Alan, you know, you're not going to shake that bear up that tree. You're not going to get him down from that tree to do anything in the DC universe. Even then, he wasn't that happy with DC. But you know, there's lots of different reasons why there's so many talented artists and writers who were involved with Before Watchmen, and obviously post Watchmen, you know, before Watchmen, they've gone on and produced lots of other things that relate to the Watchmen universe, and some of it's incredibly creative. And to sort of like, as Dave said all along, you know, it's like Watchmen, you know, even when the movie came out, if you didn't like the movie, you had the book. The book's always going to be there. That's not going to change. And the same with anything coming out from the Watchmen universe. It's nothing to do with Dave and Alan. It's still going to be, the original's still going to be there. But some of the stuff that's come out from Before Watchmen and like the later Watchmen universe, I think have been incredibly, some of the best comics ever, with some of the best writers, some of the best artists. And some of the Before Watchmen stuff I really enjoyed, actually, because again, as I said, some of the best artists and writers producing stuff.
I stopped believing that a sequel or a prequel could quote unquote ruin something when I found out that Casablanca had a TV show. So okay, whatever. And you did work with Len Wein on that, and eventually you became the writer on the Crimson Corsair feature. I did notice that of all of the features that you could have worked on, you worked on the one that was the furthest from the core Watchmen story.
Yeah, I was slightly put out about that, because I did want to like get involved in whatever character that probably there was a whole queue of people want to do, the comedian or Rorschach in particular. So I was obviously way down the back of those queues, but the idea of sort of like being involved, I was slightly disappointed that it wasn't called Tales of the Black Freighter.
Yeah, it was strange.
I'm still not totally sure why it wasn't called Tales of the Black Freighter. I was told it's something to do with copyright issues, but I can't understand that. Maybe they were just saying it to me to shut me up, I don't know. But I spoke to Dan DiDeo before I started working on it. And, you know, the idea of working with Len Wein, who's like, you know, a legend in the comics industry, you know, and it's like, he was the guy who, I think he was the guy who gave me the original coloring job for Watchmen anyway.
Yeah.
So there's an affection I had for Len, you know, from way back. And he's such a nice bloke, you know, when we met face to face for the first time, such a lovely guy. So yeah, you know, the one thing we actually haven't spoken about, it we've touched on, but we haven't sort of like called it by its name, is collaborations.
Okay.
You know, obviously collaborating with Dave and Alan was just a wonderful mesh of, you know, people who I enjoyed spending time with, but also creatively. And it's the same with most of the projects I guess. I'm incredibly fortunate to work with people usually that I like incredibly a lot. And also we're usually very incredibly talented. In fact, all of them are incredibly talented. So yeah, being involved in that sort of teamwork was just so much fun. And yeah, I would have liked to have done more Crimson Corsair, but I would have preferred it to be called Tales of the Black Freighter. I mean, that's the thing about Alan, going back to the talent of Alan, you know, the fact that he could actually make, you know, a pirate story scary. You know, he was so, is so talented. So you can't say anything enough about how talented that guy is.
Could could you if you could choose which character you would have worked on for before Watchmen, who would you have chosen?
Oh, it definitely would have been Rorschach.
Okay. Is your
I
favorite
hate
character from
drawing
Watchmen?
eyes. No, I hate drawing eyes. Trying to balance the eyes. I remember working with Garth on Hellblazer, and you know, in those days when you had a monthly book to produce, you know, it's drawing, inking, sending off, getting it printed, and seeing it. And then the number of times I saw, you know, I'd had an eye in the wrong place, you know, down by half an inch or something. Very, very frustrating. And if you ever see the stuff that I draw now, I don't draw people straight on. I always draw them like that, or like
Okay.
that, or like that. So whenever I draw eyes now, so yeah, doing Rorschach with no eyes, that would have been great. Well,
I have heard.
yeah, no effort whatsoever, no mouth, no expression. Well, that was a great thing about, like, you know, Rorschach. All the expressions that Dave managed to put on that face was just incredible, with blots and blotches.
Yes.
Very clever.
Seems like you'd be a perfect fit to draw the question.
I can't. I can. All I can remember about the question was a big question mark on his face. Is that?
Oh no, it's just
What
blank.
Oh, is it blank?
It's just blank, yeah.
Yeah, I could do that.
But
My eyes closed.
I have heard that the hardest thing to draw is the second eye.
Yeah.
You mentioned
Let's not forget the third eye.
you mentioned the Killing Joke earlier. Um, and I think, and you mentioned Alan's talent, and I think that in recent years, the most notorious thing about the Killing Joke is that the fact that Alan hates it. And I wanted to ask you what you thought of working on the Killing Joke so shortly after working on Watchmen, because I do recall Alan saying something like, aside from the content of the Killing Joke, he wasn't doing anything with it that he hadn't already done on Watchmen. I was actually wondering if color wise, you maybe felt the same way.
No, I think even when Alan is sort of like not even trying, he ends up doing something brilliant. If he wasn't trying with the Killing Joke, I find it hard to believe that he wasn't trying. But whatever he feels about it now, I think it's a really good story that's very strong and stands up incredibly well. And it shocks you in the way that you should be shocked. You shouldn't take crime and violence for granted. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, so like the big joke about, like, you know, superheroes, they never die, you know, but, and I know it becomes absurd when they kill Superman off and then he comes back as someone else and, you know, whatever sort of thing. I mean, it becomes a bit of a joke there, but the idea of sort of like being able to sort of like say, this is the effect of violence, you know, if we want to get serious for a second about, like, you know, the story. I enjoyed it. I thought the story was incredibly strong. I love the way it ended. And it goes back to what we were saying about, you know, your friends who worked in as students in cinematography and in film school, the idea of the beating heart. You know, there's ways people interpret good literature and great literature in a way that maybe even the writer or the artist had no idea of originally. And I remember talking to people about, what do I think actually happened at the end? Did Batman kill Joker? And so on and so forth, and all these things, you know, and it's just a really, that's what Alan can do, even if he's, you know, not trying. He can sort of make you think, because that's what he is. He's so talented.
Well, now I
I
gotta
remember
ask you. Yeah, okay.
Go
Now I gotta ask you what you think happens at the end.
on. I think they got happily married and they sailed off into the sunset.
I do think that, like, soon after that, when all of the Batman books were kind of taking a cue from the Killing Joke, I like to read it as, oh, Batman's flipped.
I think that's the thing. The lovely thing about, I think in a way, because a lot of British writers in particular, when they came into American comics and they got the opportunity to work in the superhero sandbox, I mean, there's a certain sort of British cynicism that's like a lot of British people tend to have. And there's a sort of, it's just, I don't know, a national characteristic. I don't know, maybe it's not here anymore, but maybe it was in those days. But people approached American heroes in a completely different to the way a lot of American writers would have approached them. So I think to someone like Alan, and no, John Wagner had a similar issue, and so did Jamie Delano, with the idea of like working in the superhero genre. You know, we obviously saw what Alan did with Swamp Thing, and obviously what he did with child and superheroes and so on and so forth. He had an approach to superheroes and the stories of superheroes that's like had a deep inbred cynicism that, you know, why do you dress up as, you know, night owl sort of thing, you know, the slightly kinky, you know, so there's lots of things that's like wouldn't have happened in that particular period with a lot of writers, American writers, that I think probably only British writers might have been able to bring into it, or European writers might have been able to bring into it. And I think that's been very satisfying to see the way it's like there's a wave of the way people, everyone from any nationality, can deconstruct what's gone on in very what used to be highly protected genres of sort of like, you know, of writing, and people deconstructed them and like approached them, juggled the bits and pieces, and coming from a different angle now. And I think, yeah, we can go back to Alan and say he basically started all of that.
People draw differently, different artists draw differently, they draw figures with different shapes and whatnot. So can you talk to me about how you would adjust your coloring techniques in order to account for that? I know maybe comparing somebody like Dave to somebody like Brian Bolland is not maybe the best example of a contrast, but since that's what we're talking about, maybe I'll go there.
I think it probably is a very good, because so they are both so precise, you know, they are both such incredible draftsmen. But because the way Dave depicts figures, he always gave me that incredible opportunity to backlight. So if I threw a cool shadow from one direction and a warm shadow from the front or the primary source of light, Dave gave me that opportunity to go back to what we were talking earlier about Richard Corbin. The idea of like, you know, having that wonderful screaming color that just throws everything forward. And it's because that complementary color can give you a three-dimensionality. And the great thing about like working with Dave is the fact that he gave me, because of the way he depicted the faces and the shadows, he would give me the opportunity, he would leave white space or space where I could fill with the backlit or the foreground light sort of thing. So that was a great fun thing to do. Brian did the same thing, but not quite as, he gave a lot of rendering, you know, just thinking off the top of my head. He made something so three-dimensional anyway, but by his rendering, this like, I could just concentrate on the foreground and like, you know, do the modeling, which was something we were able to do very effectively, I feel, because it was blue line coloring. So it's like a fully painted technique. So I can't really think off the top of my head any strong backlighting that Brian did, or I can think of a lot of strong backlighting that Dave did. So in that context, you know, if you're given the opportunity to backlight something, which Dave did a lot, then it gives you the opportunity to use color in a completely different way to someone who might not necessarily do it as much. So that was a really satisfying thing. And one of the things I do enjoy probably more about the coloring on the Watchmen than any other coloring I've done, you know, and it's something I really look for. And if anyone's coloring an artist, I'll check Pepe Larraz and see if he's got it done in there. But backlighting, yeah, he's got backlighting in there. So I could work happily with Pepe Larraz.
Can you talk to me about your color palette choices for the Killing Joke?
Well, the Killing Joke basically was sort of like, because I was doing full paint this time, it was sort of like all the primaries, and so I always used, because we had black line overlay, I didn't need to use black or Payne's grey, which is something if I'm using fully painted work, I use Payne's grey in particular. Um, so burnt umber, if we were doing the fully painted stuff, so burnt umber. I used a lot of colours in transparent colours in those days, Mars spray colours, you know, airbrush colours, and they were really nice to use. And I just remember Mars red, which is a very nice colour because you could mix that with the blue and get a really nice purple. And that was really good. So it's cobalt blue and beryllium green and so on and so forth. So I can go through the whole list of all the colours I use, but there's no, the great thing, as I said, about the limitations on Watchmen is the fact that DC gave you 60 colours that you could only use. So that was my limited palette, and they were all Y2, R2, B2, 3, B3, which is a percentage of yellow, CMYK. So it's all percentages when you use that palette. Whereas when I was doing the full colour palette, you haven't fallen asleep yet. That's good. I usually bore people when I start talking about painting and art.
Oh, you
So.
just mentioned CMYK. I just took a look at my CMYK cube.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, I'll have to get one of them. Brilliant. But yeah, no, the color palette was dictated by DC on Watchmen and by my color palette from my gouache paint and my ink paint when I was doing the mixing. That's the great thing about doing the Killing Joke, was like it was like proper painting, you know, just mixed. But the great thing was, you know, working with like Brian and having that incredible black line overlay was so satisfying because I didn't have to do the hard work. Brian had done the hard work. You know, he'd drawn everything, he'd rendered everything, and everything was beautiful.
Yeah, I talked to Dave and Brian together once, and Dave kept on razzing Brian about taking forever to draw.
Oh, God, yeah. Well, it's lucky for me. That's the reason I was brought in to do the colouring on Killing Joke.
Well, speaking of you doing the coloring on the Killing Joke instead of Brian, many years later, he did end up recoloring the Killing Joke. And today, you know, we talked about how recoloring can make a story completely different. Today, some modern editions of the Killing Joke will print both versions. Um, do you like yours better? No, that's a terrible question. What do you think it is about your coloring that works better than Brian's coloring, and maybe vice versa?
Well, the thing that I love about the fact that they actually reprinted the original colouring at Killing Joke, I think earlier on this year, as, I don't know if they actually describe it as vintage or whatever, but the original colouring, so you can actually get both now, which is great. And obviously the collected edition, again, you can get both sets of colouring. And I think for me, what is satisfying, I think you touched on it earlier, if I'd have redone the colouring for Watchmen digitally, differently, it would have been two completely different stories, more or less. And that's a great thing for me. I think what Brian did, like he did it from the Dark Knight perspective, and I did it from the madness of Joker perspective. And that's the way I like to see the two of them now. I actually do like seeing both of them together because you see the madness of the Joker and the dark, the noir effect of, like, you know, Brian's coloring for Batman. And I think that's a really nice concept. I mean, if we'd actually sat down and like talked about it, it actually would have been a very clever thing to do. But we didn't talk about it. We just actually produced them both separately. So, well, I like Brian's coloring because it is of a sort of like a noir sensibility. I wouldn't have, if I'd have been coloring it today, I wouldn't have done it that way. And I probably would not necessarily, I'm not sure if I would have done it the same way that I did it originally if I'd have been doing digitally now. I don't know what I would have done thinking about it. I do tend to do color palettes, colorful palettes still. So, you know.
Can I tell you what other legendary colorist, Jose Villarrubia, told me about the two versions.
Oh, go on.
He says he prefers yours.
Oh, they do prefer mine.
Yeah, Jose prefers yours because, for the reason that you stated, Brian's version grounds the story and makes it a little bit more realistic. Um, but the Killing Joke works a little better when it's not being realistic,
Oh, that's good.
right? So I think that's an
That,
interesting.
that,
I think that's probably
no,
an
I'm
interesting point.
happy
Yeah.
with that. I'm terrible because I'm not very good at taking criticism, even 30 years later. So no, I'm very happy with that comment. And I think I always did it from that concept of sort of like the madness of, everything was colored by the madness of Joker. And I think it's nice to sort of like people see it in a similar way. And for me, that is the reason why I love colorists who use color in a way that sort of like says, okay, this is fantasy. This is sort of like something unexpected, and show you screaming color effects, which is Richard Corbin for me. He can color anything any way he wants. Could. But when he does that backlighting and on Den and so like the mad skies, we know it's a fantasy world. We know it's not, might be grounded in reality, but there's a madness to it. And I think for me that speaks of the better coloring. You want to bring people into your world,
Yes.
and if they look out the window and see muted color palette, actually it's a very striking color palette out there at the moment. Of course, we've got sunshine in September in the UK, so what can you say? But now it's nice to see things as like a saying, you are coming into a separate world now. You enjoy it.
If of all the comics that you have worked on that we haven't mentioned, what has been your favorite to work on?
Ooh, that's a hard one. It's if you asked me this 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, I would have had so few comics to compare. But now I've worked on so many comics over the last 40 years. There's so many highlights, working with Garth Ennis, working with like John Wagner, working with Brian Bolland, the fact that like, working on the two biggest selling comics in history, certainly DC's history, I can't argue with that. For enjoyment factor, I think for me, so like it would be Judge Dredd. I mean, deep down, I'm still a comics fan. I still love reading comics that take me into a different world. And for me, the idea of sort of like working on Judge Dredd with a great writer like John Wagner or Al Ewing or anyone, they've got a new generation of writers now.
God, Al Ewing's so
It's
good.
just, eh?
Al Ewing's so good.
Definitely. I mean, he had the sensibilities of and the humor of John Wagner, which is exceptional, and he could still have that adventure. He was very, very clever as well. Al, in a way that's like, and I've worked with him a number of times, and again, he's one of my favorite Red writers. I haven't really worked with him on anything else. But yeah, it's always a collaboration, the enjoyment of the collaboration as much as anything, and that colors my judgment. But creatively, collaboratively wise, and everything, the Democracy series that I did with John Wagner, which Judge Dredd, and I actually first time I felt I'd actually discovered who I was as an artist. And funny enough, that was actually a long time ago, probably not around the time of Watchmen. And we've subsequently done other things. John Wagner and I did an update on it just last year or the year before. And we followed the lives of some of the protagonists who've grown up in that universe. And the great thing about the stuff for Judge Dredd, he actually ages real time.
Mm-hmm.
He's a clone, but he ages real time. And there's science fiction reasons why he always looks big, tough, and bluff, is because of science fiction reasons. But yeah, I mean, Judge Dredd is my world that I love, and I enjoy working with that world. Yeah.
I was actually wondering if working on the Hellblazer was going to give Judge Dredd a run for his money, because I kind of thought you were going to say Judge Dredd because of the cultural relevance of Judge Dredd, especially. But
The great thing about I mean, yeah, that's probably close second, I should think, in so many ways, because I love horror. and I love working with Garth. Collaboratively, yeah, that comes very high up there. So you give me an impossible task, really, in some ways. I'm incredibly fortunate to actually work with so many talented writers and people. In working with like people like John and Garth, Dave and Mitch and Fred and Joe.
What a resume you've had. I haven't even mentioned Pat Mills, Peter Milligan. That's
Definitely, thank you.
quite the resume. And I guess I'll close off with a couple of questions, which is if you could go back to 1975 and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be? In terms of writing, so like nothing about the stock market or in terms of comics, nothing about the stock market or anything.
Oh, it's just comics.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you very much for sort of like directing me, because there was a very great poet in the UK, John Betjeman, who is the poet laureate. He died 20, 30 years ago. And they asked him on his deathbed, more or less, what he would have done differently in his life. And he said he would have had more sex. So I'm glad that you asked me about comics in particular. I think I would have liked to have learned how to draw in black line sooner.
Really?
It took me about 15, 20 years to get to a stage where I felt comfortable with black line. You know, interpreting black, pencil, graphite into black line is one of the best disciplines anyone can have as an artist, as far as I'm concerned. It's such a discipline. And when I see my favorite artist, which is something why I keep going back to comics if I want to be impressed by artists, is to see how beautifully depicted and delineated the human form can be in the purest sense. And that's by all these incredible artists who have been working throughout my career and still working today, and the new guys who come in, who are doing some beautiful figure work. I love figure work. So yeah, I would have loved to have learned how to use technically to be a lot earlier in doing black line.
My God, it's so crazy because when I was young, I know like somebody like John Byrne or George Perez would be considered a realistic artist. And now I see the artists that are coming up today, and I'm like, wow, that is
Yeah.
a whole level up of realism. And I guess what is next for John Higgins?
Hopefully more of the same. I love what I do. I love being able to come down. I commute such a long distance. It takes about 5 minutes to walk from my back door to my drawing board. So my commute is very, and it, rain, I'm like the US Postal Service, through rain, snow, hail, I'll get to my drawing board. So yeah, I just want to carry on doing what I'm doing. I'd like to do more Razorjack, and I'd like to do more Dread. I like to work with John Wagner more. I like to work with Dave Gibbons more. I like to work with Garth Ennis more. But other than that,
And some of those are in the pipeline.
I hope so. Yes, they are. Some of them are.
And my very, very last question has nothing to do with any of that because you mentioned earlier John Buscema and Conan. I'm a Filipino, so I have to ask this question. What is your opinion? Because this is kind of controversial. What is your opinion of John Buscema on Conan as inked by Alfredo Alcala?
The best ever. The best ever. Yeah. Yes, I'm just blown away by his technical ability, and for me, he seemed to interpret the pencils. I don't know what John Buscema might have thought about it, but I thought he interpreted the pencils perfectly. You could definitely see it's John Buscema's work. Now you've started me off on a whole new angle. I just love Alfred Alcala's work. Love it.
That's great. I asked that because John notoriously hated it.
Oh, really?
Because he thought it made it look like not his work.
Oh, right.
Thank you.
Well, I thought it was a great synthesis.
Thank you so much, Mr. John Higgins. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been really a pleasure. You asked me so many interesting questions, and I'm going to go away and think about better answers for them now. Thank you.
Thank you.